Welcome. I'm Jeff Yost, the director of the Charles Babbage Institute for Computing, Information, and Culture. We are a research institute and a leading archive for facilitating and conducting the study of the digital world. And even though this is a virtual event, I'm here at the University of Minnesota and will begin with a land acknowledgement statement. We acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. We are thrilled to have as our speaker today, the 2023-2024 Tomash Fellow, Alex Reiss-Sorokin. She is a doctoral candidate at MIT's Haas department. Haas stands for History, Anthropology, Science, Technology, and Society at MIT. Alex's scholarship focuses on the social, political, and technological aspects of legal practice and knowledge making. In addition to being a Ph.D. candidate, Alex is a lawyer with law degrees from both Tel Aviv University and NYU. Her list of honors and accomplishments is long and includes being the ABF Access Lex Predoctoral Fellow in Legal and Higher Education. And Alex has presented scholarship widely at many leading conferences. We are also delighted that Alex has recently been offered and accepted a postdoctoral fellowship position at Princeton University and the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study. Her principal home base there is Princeton's Davis Center, a center focused on information and truth. Q&A will follow the talk, and if you could use the raise hand function, I will call on people in the order that they raise their hands to make comments or ask questions to the speaker. So again, thrilled to have Alex here today for this talk, and her talk today is entitled From Research to Search, Legal Research Technologies, 1964 to 1994.
Hello, everyone. Just give me one brief moment to share my screen with you and we'll begin. Okay. Okay, hopefully you should see my slides now. I'm thrilled to talk to you about my research today. And we will, oh great, I see my slides are showing, wonderful. And I'll begin by introducing myself. My name is Alex. I'm a lawyer and a socio-legal scholar of information technology. My training and methods are interdisciplinary. I combine archival research with legal research. I do oral histories and ethnographic research in which I use observations and semi-structured interviews. But today I'll be talking about mostly the archival and the oral history research I conduct. I study issues at the intersection of law, work, and computing. I treat law as work and practice more than a doctrinal body of rules. And you'll see in my work how I approach the intersection of computing, work, and law. Okay, so for the talk today, just to orient you, I'll start by talking about the three big themes, three big lenses through which I approach my research. These are the automation of work, trust in technology, and technology and justice. Then I'll zoom in on the shift from books to computers and legal research in the 1960s United States. I will look at first what lawyers did before the computer, and we'll try to maybe dispel some of the misconceptions about legal research in the age of print. Then I'll examine the automation process. What was it like to develop hardware and software for professional users like lawyers? And of course, how the problem they were trying to solve changed as they were trying to automate legal research. I will then turn to early users of legal research technologies and examine how they assessed and what tools they used to ascertain the validity of this new technology. Lastly, we'll talk a little bit about the long-term effects of automating legal research and the legal information market today. And I'll finish by discussing the main takeaways of my research. So we'll begin with the first big theme, which is automation of work, and as it is sometimes is called, the future of work. Since the Luddites in the 19th century England, and maybe even before, the promise to automate work met both enthusiasm and skepticism. And we know from studies in history, sociology, and economics that these were not simply stories of technology replacing workers, but rather that automation augmented work, altered it, and also sometimes created more human work than initially before automation. It was also not just about efficiency. Considerations like control, surveillance of workers also played a role in the introduction of information technology and automation in the workplace. And most importantly, for my purposes, debates about automation were often debates about the nature of work. For example, the boundary work between mechanical and skilled work was about creating differences in the labor force. The focus on rules and the elimination of human judgment was meant to bolster control and predictability of expert work. And the imagined user played a role in what technologies, how technologies were designed and how they then constrained workers that use them. So I already told you that I view law as work. This body of work really informs my approach that looks at the division of labor in the law firm. So I look beyond just lawyers to see the effects of automation and not just the effects, but also the design of the technology. So that's kind of the first big theme. The second big theme, I have a big focus in my work on trust and technology. And this is not, I mean, the literature on trust is a voluminous body of work. So this is just to give you a taste of it. We know from classic work in sociology that in modernity, trust in people was supplemented by more distant forms of trust, like trust in institutions, trust in experts, and abstract capacities like money. And we also know that later sociological work on trust turned to focus specifically on the mechanisms and technologies of trust, specifically technologies that seem to require no trust at all, such as numbers, such as machines, and formal rules. This work also pointed to the constructed nature of concepts like accuracy, validation, or reliability, showing that they have a history and a particular context in which they developed. And most importantly, for my purposes, we also see throughout the scholarship, actually from the very early sociological work on this topic, that trust was not simply a matter of informing people. It was not just about knowledge, it was also about belief, and it sat in between those two ideas. So knowledge and belief informed what worked, what people trusted. And in this work, you'll see I focus primarily on the strategies of developers to cultivate trust among their users and belief, and the tactics of the users to ascertain whether a technology was trustworthy. In addition, I tried to examine competing cultures of trust and how they interact. For example, if traditional forms of trust play a role, even among newer concepts like trust in code. And where do users and developers draw their notions of trust and credibility? Finally, the third lens through which I kind of study my topic is technology and justice. This really emphasizes the space in between promise and reality. So scholars examine this gap in different ways. Some of them focus on the impact on public, so not just what the developers think or do or try to achieve, but how it disparately impacts publics that use or misuse or don't use the specific technology. Other scholars examined the work of the social construction of technology, so the kind of negotiations and determinations among the developers that make their way into the final forms of technology as technical decisions are interwoven into normative ones. And for me, it also includes examining markets and industries, which is also an approach scholars in the past have taken to consider monopolies or industries as a whole to capture the effects of technology or the gaps between what they promise and what and their real world impact. And in the field I study, these questions are particularly salient because, as you will see, in digitization and conversion in general, the assumption is often that there is really no trust involved at all, because all we do is convert data from one medium to another. And often it's the case that people assume that data is independent of its medium and we can just transform it from book to computer without major interventions. And you'll see how that plays out in our talk today. So from this body of work, I really my takeaway is that it's not enough to study the development of technology, but we really need to incorporate this gap between promise and reality to look at how are promises made, what holds them together, how are they being interpreted, and also what mechanisms determine what technologies get included or excluded from debates about justice and injustice. Moving on to my case study for today, I will talk about the transformation between print and computer in a specific field, the legal field. On the left, you can see two partners at the prestigious and profitable law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, New York-based. They're photographed in their law firm library, which you can see in the photograph has many books and many working stations. The left photograph is part of the marketing materials produced in 1973 to advertise OBAR or Lexis, the technology we will talk about today. As you can see, the books are still evident in the photograph, but they move to the background. Two men are having a conversation over a Lexis terminal, which includes a computer, a keyboard, and a phone. What I want to do today is to delve deeper into both sides of this transition. So we will look at lawyers' practices before the computer, and then we'll discuss how the process of automation brought about a change to this field. And specifically, I will focus on the transformation in one product. So the local bar association in Ohio developed in the 1960s OBAR, the Ohio Bar Automated Research System. And by the 1970s and later by the 1980s, it was called Lexis, and it is still called that till this day. But in the process, it went from being a local software product developed by and for Ohio lawyers to being a national and then international service that provides a suite of services to corporate customers as well as law firms and governments. I use various sources to tell this story: photos, correspondence, internal reports and memos, but also case law, published materials like trade magazines, and manuals and handbooks. I do this to describe, I'll give you an example, how secretaries, assistants, junior associates, and clerks were treated, and how they divide the labor among them in the law firm before the computer and after the computer. So I use office management manuals and secretary training materials to do that. And of course, news coverage. So just to give you a brief overview of the history from OBAR to Lexis, you will see that our story starts in 1964 with the establishment of OBAR. It begins, the Ohio State Bar Association begins by questioning lawyers about their habits. And by 1967, they contract Data Corporation, a Dayton, Ohio company that previously developed an information retrieval system for the Air Force. All is local in this story at that stage. And by 1969, they have a first commercial terminal that they install in the office of the Attorney General in Ohio. It's celebrated in the newspapers at the time. In the background, what happens between 1967 to 1969, when they installed the first terminal, is that Data Corporation, our software developer, is bought by Mead, which is a paper manufacturer, also local originally. And it is quickly transformed into, it is spun off to a subsidiary named Mead Data Central, which assumes kind of the software development part of this story. So as you can see from the beginning, we see a collaboration between lawyers and technologists. The technologists, in a way, start to take over in 1973 with the introduction of Lexis. Lexis is introduced by Mead Data Central. By then, the system is available in a few other states except for Ohio. And 4 years later, you can see that the subscribers grow to 144 subscribers in a variety of states, and Mead Data Central and Lexis as a service start to expand. In 77, it becomes profitable. It is not profitable up until that point, and the royalties that were supposed to sustain the Ohio State Bar Association in the development of this software and the conversion process are not really flowing until 1977. By 1980, a few things happen. The Ohio State Bar Association is really phased out of the picture. Lexis starts service in the UK. It's the first international service it provides, and it then expands to other locales. It also pioneers its Nexus service, which is a news database similar, that works with a similar search engine to the Lexis service. And by then, it's hard to estimate how many subscribers Lexis has. So I used here the kind of numbers it generates in revenue and the price at which it is sold in 1994 to read Elsevier, which will give you some estimate of the success of this business. Okay, so before we talk about computers, let us talk about what lawyers did before the computer and how much it was similar to that image we started with of Sullivan and Cromwell's legal library. What I can tell you is that we know surprisingly little about legal research practices. I think it's because of two reasons. One, it is one of the hardest things to describe or to capture as historians. We have many documents and texts about what people say, but we have few sources about what people did. But also in this case, I will argue that one of the reasons it is hard to know much about the practices of lawyers before the computer is that really the interest in lawyers' habits and practices coincided with the early talk of automating their work. You can see on the screen a quote from Morris L. Cohen, who was a legal librarian at UPenn Law School Library. in which he says, I discovered that we know a great deal about the materials of legal research, but almost nothing about the actual processes, actual procedures used by lawyers in their search into the law. The interesting part about Morris's Cohen presentation is that it was a talk he gave at the annual meeting of the Special Committee on Electronic Data Retrieval of the ABA in 1968. In other words, his interest in research habits of lawyers was due to the great interest in automating lawyers' work. And it evolved together. Before the 1960s, no one was collecting data on this point, and it did not appear as a particularly important question worth pursuing. We do know some things, however, and I'll describe a little bit of what we know. What we know comes from a few surveys by Bar Association, mostly in Missouri, and it's Philadelphia. It says Pennsylvania, but it's mostly restricted to Philadelphia, and Canada, which had a national survey in 1972, which provides a lot of empirical data. What we know is that most offices looked more like the photo you see in front of you that documents a small law firm and not like the Sullivan Cromwell office. So most lawyers were solo practitioners or practiced in small law firms. They were not members of the large law firms that were still a minority. And legal research was a small part of what lawyers did, estimated at 15 or 16% of their time. It varied greatly with the size of their firm, with the duration of their practice, and their specialty. So seasoned lawyers or lawyers who specialized in a particular field did less research than lawyers just starting out. In addition, the size of law firms also played a role, but there are conflicting findings on that point. So some found that smaller law firms did more research because they had to cover more areas of the law with less personnel. Others found that large law firms did more research than the smaller law firms. One way to settle this difference may be to say that large law firms indeed conducted more legal research, but it wasn't the lawyers who were doing legal research in large law firms, which leads to the following finding from these surveys. We learned that delegation and consultation were widespread practices in legal research. Senior lawyers delegated research tasks to their juniors who were associates, but also assistants, students, secretaries, and clerks. It was common practice to either transfer a case to another attorney or ask for advice, particularly if the matter involved other state or a field of expertise different from our attorneys. And the other thing we learned is that practice was very local. So it wasn't federal, it wasn't concentrated on the US Constitution, and it was also not heavy on litigation. Most lawyers practice in civil matters, and they focused more on know-how and less on large points of federal law. We also know they relied on their office libraries quite a bit. That was their first resource. Every lawyer, no matter how small her practice was, had some books. As you can see in the photograph, books were part of every office. But lawyers also developed techniques to share resources. Legal buildings were very common. So these are buildings that had a few law firm offices in the same vicinity, and they could pull together their resources. Solo practitioners often shared offices exactly for this purpose. Young lawyers negotiated access to larger libraries at larger law firms. And in a few central cities, there were public law libraries. These are cities like Boston, Philadelphia, or New York. The organized bar had libraries that lawyers relied heavily upon, and law school libraries also served as extensions of the libraries that lawyers had in their offices. So essentially, legal research was consulting resources to answer a legal question. And like any research, there are many researchers in the room today. So you would maybe relate to the problem. The problem was that case law was published chronologically and not by subject matter, but the researcher had to discern the matters relating to a specific topic. So although Laura's concept of legal research was a mental process or a cognitive activity, we also know that legal research was highly physical. And that's because many of the technologies for legal research were books, various books of different kinds. This was also the most common complaint about legal research at the time. We're talking about the 1960s and the 1970s. It required taking books off library shelves, and it required utilizing many types of books. For example, a lawyer would use a treatise to find a relevant case. She would then need to go to the volume with the reported case to read the case, and then to use a different tool like the Key West Digest system or a citation index to find more cases similar to the case she's looking at, or to ascertain how later cases treated the case she was looking at. We also know that lawyers really didn't like doing legal research. They complained it was cumbersome and inefficient. But two things are important to keep in mind here. First, that legal research was simply not as profitable as other activities that these lawyers engaged in. So there were many incentives to keep it to a minimum. And in addition, despite the bookish image of legal research, it often involved other things other than books. So lawyers consulted with their colleagues, they relied on their notes and personal indexes, and they delegated research and usually talked with people about their research. Here you can see one of the early print legal research technologies developed in the second half of the 19th century. Like many other technologies that are still used. This is the West key number system. I mention it not just because it was one of the first legal research technologies that lawyers used, but also because it is local to Minnesota. It was headquartered in St. Paul, Minnesota by John West in the second half of the 19th century. And it was revolutionary in the sense that it had a taxonomic system, an indexical system to case law that allowed lawyers to quickly find cases that were similar, but also to put cases into larger categories and find the underlying principles of case law. And these technologies, I mean, West key number system, as well as Shepard citations and a few other technologies of the time, were pioneered by legal publishers. And I say that to stress that there was a research infrastructure that supported legal research that was at once social and technological. So as you can see, many people were involved in this process. It was not merely a mental or cognitive process happening in lawyers' heads, but it was a deeply social process. Okay, so let's talk about automating legal research. How'd that look like? In 1967, OBAR was introduced as a system for end users. In other words, lawyers, as opposed to information retrieval specialists, which was another word for librarians. And it was famously defined by Will Harrington, one of the pioneers of OBAR, as non-indexed, full-text, online, interactive system. I won't get into the specifics here, but just I bring this definition to say that it was geared to eliminate intermediaries. So it was non-indexical, meaning it wanted to eliminate the categories that we saw previously with the West Digest system. It offered full text search, so without summaries or headnotes that legal editors or publishers produced, and it was online and interactive in the sense that it promoted direct use by the lawyer without requiring the assistance of typists, technicians, or secretaries. The idea was that the system would allow lawyers direct access to the data, unmediated access. So there would be nothing between the lawyer and case law. At least that was the vision, and that was the definition of the system in 1967. And since this definition was cemented as the famous contribution of OBAR to the field of information retrieval writ large. What I want to argue is that intermediation appeared as the problem to be solved in a later stage. So for my research, I learned that the project began in 1964, and it began with a slightly different focus. In 1964, the Ohio State Bar Association began to study lawyers' habits as part of the project to automate legal research. As you heard, it was a common practice at the time to assess the needs before developing software. And they found that the problem was inefficient use of lawyer time. So the problem they, at the Ohio State Bar Association, found was that really the physical labor of hauling books off library shelves, as they termed it, was a waste of time. And it was this part, the mechanical part is how they called it, that they wished to automate. The substantive part, as opposed to the mechanical part of the legal analysis, is something that they wanted to preserve for lawyers. And the point was just to make legal research more efficient, in part to equalize the playing field in the legal profession. So one of the original purposes of OBAR was that solo practitioners and small practices in Ohio will have access to resources that were not less comprehensive than the large law firms. So in a way, to make legal research both more accessible, more efficient, and cheaper to both customers and lawyers. As OBAR's developers in the Ohio State Bar Association were interacting with IT pioneers from Data Corporation, the language of information technology started to shape their approach. And little by little, the problem to be solved with the new technology was no longer the inefficiency of book legal research, but rather the problem of intermediaries who were intervening in the research process. So the distinction between intermediaries versus end users came from the IT world at a time where the penetration of more and more computers gave hope that there will be greater markets for information technology services and products. And by 1969, when the hardware and software were developed, the problem was recast as intermediation. So people who were once essential to the legal research process, like librarians, assistants, secretaries, and even other lawyers, that's important to stress, were now people in the way of legal research that the computer was to eliminate. This later narrative was cemented in the publications and in the descriptions of OBAR pioneers, and it is used till this day to describe what the technology was meant to achieve. So we can see that even before any computers were developed, the object of automation, what legal research was and how it was being understood by contemporaneous lawyers, had begun to morph into legal search. Once intermediation became the problem to be solved and direct use by lawyers the goal, OBAR and Data Corporation, and then Meet Data Central, went out of their way to promise that lawyers could easily learn to operate the system. You can see here their ad that talking to the computer requires plain English. They stressed it did not require knowledge of code or, as a matter of fact, legalese. That was also one of their selling points. And to demonstrate that it was easy to operate and interactive, they conducted demonstrations, but also training sessions in which they trained lawyers and others in typing, search framing, and basic computer theory. If it sounds like a lot of things to do in one day, you're absolutely right. Lawyers, secretaries, and librarians, who were among the other people who attended these training sessions, found them overwhelming. The reason it was overwhelming was because there was a tension between the amount of training that was actually required, which was greater than one day, and Obar's argument that the system was easy to use. And also lawyers and the personnel of law firms were reluctant to stay longer for trainings that they viewed as redundant. So they had to kind of walk a fine line between training people to use the product and delivering on their claim that it was as easy as talking to a person. And they modeled this argument about dialogue and interactiveness after a familiar process of legal research, where most lawyers, as we saw before, were talking to an actual person when they were doing legal research. I argue that this was meant to divert attention away from the computer as an intermediary. So rather than focusing on the way legal research was transformed, this conversation, this discourse about intermediaries turn the attention to the way human subjectivity intervened in the process of research. So it made human judgment and intervention suspect while diverting attention away from the computer, which was transforming legal research in significant ways. I'll give you just a brief example, which we can explore more in the Q&A if you wish. But you can see in the blue circle here, I circled the number of results. So in print legal research, there was no number of results. You would review case law or legislation or whatever you were reviewing as an attorney, and you had no definitive number of results. Here, for the first time, the system produced only a number. So here, there's no preview of results. There's no other context. And the number is not an accurate number. So the point of the number wasn't to say that there are 131 documents, but it was to give an indication to the searcher if the search was too wide or too narrow. So it just gave this number. And then, as you can see in this example of search, the user then modified it. He or she narrowed the search down to contain fewer results. This was one way in which research was becoming search. So numbers stood for substantive case law. Okay, how did users respond to this change? In the late 1960s, the first remote communication consoles began to appear in law firms and libraries across Ohio, but they did not look like the terminal in this picture. The first terminals looked more like this. They were operated by women, often female secretaries, and that's because they had keyboards. The keyboards in particular repelled lawyers because they were synonymous with female secretaries, and lawyers protested that they did not know how to use a computer or type. And we can see from this image and from the market, this was not a marketing image, this is just documentation from Lexis of an operator operating an Obar console, that the distinction between mechanical and substantive operation mapped onto gender and class differences. And and the choice of placing two men in suits, like in this picture, was meant to convey a message that there was nothing feminine about using a Lexis terminal, and that lawyers could use it directly without the assistance of their secretaries, assistants, or librarians. These initial consoles were teletype terminals. They had no screens, and they were very noisy and clunky. Lawyers had to imagine that on the other side of these noisy and clunky machines was a computer, and it was its responses that were printed on the continuous roll of paper that the teletype produced. They used religious terms to describe their attitudes towards these machines. They spoke about themselves as skeptics or zealots, and describe their doubt and belief through terms like enchantment and disenchantment. There were many techniques of trust that the developers of OBAR used. You can see some of them here. I'm sorry, this slide is a little bit crowded, but you can see that there were of different types. Some of these were meant to visually prove that a technology works, so the demonstrations were kind of carefully orchestrated displays of live search. They were rehearsed and repeated many times and manipulated behind the scenes for shorter response time. The training sessions focused specifically on skill acquisition and not on theory or validity or accuracy of the software. They relied heavily on interpersonal skills. In many law firms, they had insiders. So these were secretaries, students, or assistants that served as ambassadors. Sometimes they received a fee from Lexis, from OBAR or Lexis, to operate as the go-between between OBAR, Lexis, and the law firm, and they were more knowledgeable and more practiced in conducting searches. Other techniques of trust were discursive, so malfunctions were described as temporary bugs. The full manifestation of software was always to come, and it was a matter of keeping the promise alive. The system was always described as being on the verge of being complete in a way that kept lawyers as subscribers. And of course, it drew heavily on the expertise of the bar and the lawyers who lent it some of their own institutional credibility. Reliability and verification on the user side were problematic. It was also problematic on the developer side, because as we know from the work of Donald McKinsey, the existence of bugs can be proved, but not their absence. And although the developers had some verification techniques early on, lawyers could not replicate them. And in the cases in which they tried, they miserably failed. And I mean, the general finding from this period is a bit surprising. The surprise is that lawyers really didn't focus, they didn't worry much about accuracy or validity, and they focused more on technical reliability, basically whether the system was up or down, whether they could use it or not. And they didn't express much concern about the validity of its results. But from the few controversies around its reliability, we learned that really the text in the machine was not identical at all to the text in books, and verification was a real challenge. We learned that conversion was not simply a matter of typing text from the printed volume onto punch cards, but it required constant determination by typists who had to determine which data to put in which segment of the database. And of course, it entailed design choices that made any comparison between print and computer impossible. So the number you saw before could not be, the number of results you saw before displayed by the system could not be mapped onto real volumes of case law. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about legal research today. Whoa, sorry, my bad. In a way, the transformation, sorry, my mouse is acting up. In a way, the transformation that OBAR/Lexis ushered was too successful. So the transformation of treating court cases as any other information was too successful. And I say that because nowadays lawyers start their legal research on Google, which is a general purpose search engine, not a specialized service. You can see from the data that the average lawyer spends about 18% of her time on legal research, which is higher than what it used to be in the 1960s. But also you can see that some lawyers still utilize print sources, although none use them exclusively. And the two major services that still dominate the legal information market today are Lexis and Westlaw. Westlaw is Lexis's main competitor. It came out of West Publishing Company in Minnesota. In 1976, it pioneered its own legal research database, Westlaw, which has become the main competitor for Lexis since. From this, you can also see that legal research is highly consolidated. Lexis is owned by Reed Elsevier, Westlaw by Thomson Reuters. The pricing on these services is very tiered, so it's very hard to understand how much law firms pay for the service, let alone law schools. Some of these are under NDA agreements, so they cannot even share how much they pay for the service. And interestingly, some of the same tools of persuasion that I described in the 1960s and 1970s are still used by Lexis and Westlaw. They draw heavily on demonstrations. They do beta testing with a small group of friends of the family. They use ambassadors. These are often people known to the users, like student representatives, or reps that sit in law firms that serve as the go-between, again, between the company and the law firm. So briefly, I'll review the takeaways, and I ordered them by the themes I introduced to you early on, so we can take a look at where how I'm thinking about the implications of my research. So first, on the automation point, we can see that work is transformed through automation. The problem to be solved and the technology to solve it co-evolve. You saw that early on, legal work was made sense of, it was ordered, it was paid attention to, and it was conceptualized for the first time for the computer. And in addition, we also saw that language, schemas, and ideals from computing sipped into the way work was conceptualized and were also transforming it. Work is subdivided into mechanical and skilled / substantial parts, which correspond to differences in gender and class. We saw that with secretaries and female legal practitioners. In the area of trust, interestingly, the promise of automation is easily believed. This was a finding that surprised me, that I found myself needing to explain why users so readily trusted, and even in the face of contradictory evidence, and there were no real controversies around the reliability or accuracy of this service, apart from 2 or 3 exceptions. And as for the techniques of trust, just a review of what I've talked about. So one is the reliance on traditional forms of trust, interpersonal ties and institutions, and the professional expertise of lawyers were heavily influential in bolstering the reliability of this new service. In addition, diverting attention away from dramatic changes in mediation were done by focusing on people and not on technology or computers. In addition, framing technology as requiring no trust at all and focusing on skill acquisition as opposed to proof of accuracy or validity. Finally, on the technology and justice theme, we can see that digitizing has a universalizing effect that rids information of context. Local context often has social and political underpinnings that are being lost with digitization and universalization. I haven't gotten to that point almost at all, but we can talk about the service versus product perceptions of this service and how they changed along the life of Uber/Lexis. And finally, that this project was a costly one. It was mostly financed by Ohio lawyers, at least initially, because it required a big investment of human labor and money. But this human labor was systematically erased in later stages when this technology were being taught it as digital and automatic and computer-based. I'll end here, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Alex, for that wonderful and insightful talk. As we wait for other questions, I'll go ahead and ask one. One slide you had was on surveillance, and I'm wondering in two different settings. One, law firms and surveillance of workers, and did that occur, and at what point and how? And then the other is in reading Sarah Lambden's wonderful book, and seeing the surveillance that that Relics and an analytics firm that's selling private information to ICE and other very ethically questionable uses of people's private data. When and how did Lexis collect information on users, and did that only occur later on with certain acquisitions by other companies?
Good questions. So on the point of surveilling workers in law firms, I mean, there was some tracking of legal searches. It wasn't done necessarily by the law firm, but it was done by the software development teams in Me Data Central later on. So they were monitoring some of the searches that were coming up to locate any issues or problems. So there was that. Other than that, I'm not aware of any surveillance of workers, but I will tell you that part of the way the pricing worked in various times for various users was by search. And that meant that the search queries were important for pricing. So both on the side of the company, they were looking for ways to help users to kind of formulate their search queries better, but also lawyers were avoiding research or developing their own techniques to kind of search the system only once and only with the correct keywords. So it wasn't that they were looking directly at the content of the search request. There was also like a privilege problem here, right? So for Lexis to review the search results, but it did play a role. So the queries that people were entering into the system did play a role in the development and in the pricing, at least as a minimum. Should I monitor the questions? Sam, would you like to go next?
Sure. Jeff, you were muted. I don't know if you were saying something before.
Oh, I just called on you, Sam. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. I don't know. Am I allowed to have my video on, or should I leave it off?
Put it on. Yeah.
You put on, yeah.
Oh, I'm not allowed to, but that's okay. You can just imagine me talking and smiling here. So I wanted to ask about the kind of specific historical context of the beginning of the development of this system. 1964 in particular stands out to me as a important year in the legal landscape of the United States with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And I also think of the Economic Opportunity Act, which was the big Johnson administration war on poverty legislation that included the legal services programs, which were programs to federally fund the legal services for the poor across the United States. So I'm thinking about that. So I'm kind of curious, like, was this legal, what was like the legal context in this specific historical period that was like getting people excited about creating a computer system? And then the other kind of aspect of the specific historical circumstance around when this began, I'm curious, like, on the automation side of things, you said that they were like frustrated with intermediaries, or that was like the problem was depicted as these intermediaries. Was that like a problem of trying to like cut costs? Were these people that were, paid higher than they would like to, and this system was pitched as a cost-cutting measure? Or was it like an overall operational efficiency thing? Yeah, so those two questions. One, the kind of legal context of the Civil Rights Act and the Economic Opportunity Act, and the other being like, what were the kind of economic incentives for creating the system in the mid-1960s? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, great question. So I have tried to understand the context for this system for many years now, and it's hard to say. So I found no specific references to the issues that you raised. It was very local at the time, and it was very driven by the organized bar that was still a very conservative institution. There wasn't much talk about civil rights, as I mean, 1971 was the year of the big student protests and the Ohio Four. So there was none of that in the archive, in their correspondence, or in the materials I surveyed. So it's hard to say. I think that more influential than that was the discourse at the time that was published in journals like Geometrics, and celebrated the promise of computers to usher in a new era of law as science, law that could be predicted and ordered with the power of numbers and machines. That was very on top of mind for some of these figures, both on the part of the lawyers and the part of the information technology pioneers. As for your second question about the intermediaries, this was more of a conceptual shift. So the chapter in which I deal with this in my dissertation really traces the conceptual shift among the developers. It didn't necessarily correspond to a problem in the world. That was my argument, that it wasn't as if intermediaries were eliminated. So the assistants and secretaries and students and clerks continued to be part of law firms. They didn't go anywhere. So in that sense, it wasn't meant to replace them, but it was meant to promote a new idea, a new concept of what legal research was about. And the argument was it was about, for them, for the people who argued this among the developers, that it was about allowing unmediated access. So the expert on legal research is the lawyer that has the legal question. It was not the librarian. It was not the assistant. It was not this network of people who have been providing research support for years, but it was the individual lawyer. And that was a conceptual shift among the developers that translated into the product they were developing. It wasn't necessarily something that they were responding to among the legal professionals in law firms. Okay, I think we have one more question.
Thank you.
If you're talking, we can't hear you. I think you're muted. Still can't hear you.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
I was clicking away to no avail. Thanks for a great talk. A quick comment and then I hope a quick question. Ohio was unusually fertile ground post-World War II for these kinds of initiatives, not just OBAR, but what became OCLC and the dissemination of captured Axis scientific and military material, specially managed out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And that might help a little bit in thinking about what Sam asked, but it was very clearly, it was not just in the air, but my guess is there were likely staff members shared among these various initiatives. The question is, thinking about legal materials and search from the other end, in particular law firms' management of their own case materials. And forgive me for asking, but as you likely know, the concepts of invisible work and articulation work from sociology, especially the research of folks like Lucy Suchman and Lee Starr and Anselm Strauss, do look at examples reaffirming what you said about class and gender differences being particularly important, and in considering legal research more generally. So I was wondering if you thought about the application of the concepts of invisible work and articulation work to your own research. And of course, if not, fine. But I'm just curious if you have. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for these comments. The most common question I get is, why Ohio? Why did this thing come out of Ohio? And it is surprising until you realize that Ohio, until recently, was a powerhouse, not just of lawyers and law firms, which it most definitely was at the time, but also of other types of innovation and culture. So as for your other question, so I think about it more in the terms of Stephen Shapin's epistemic support personnel. So, and I think it's very similar, right? The idea that we have all of this infrastructure behind lawyers, like we do behind scientists, like we do behind other professionals, that is really erased when we talk about professions and expertise. So yeah, thank you for that comment. I really appreciate it. And I think there are many similarities in the way you describe it and the way I think about it.
All right, thank you.
And I know we're a couple minutes beyond the hour, but we have a question in the Q&A that was typed in, and I'll read it. How does this technological change impact ideas of legal expertise? It seems that legal research was more collective, discursive, with legal search more individual. There's a shift in whether fellow lawyers or legal assistants or traditional legal texts are considered legitimate sources of legal knowledge.
Yeah, excellent question. Yeah, it was one of the promises when they began to develop some of these data service, not necessarily Lexis, there were a few competitors. They thought about it in those terms, right? Lay people could search for information and they wouldn't need owning all the printed volumes of case law. It didn't really translate into greater access for lay publics. And it didn't really diminish lawyers as kind of the authority on legal knowledge. Although I would say that in recent discourse around ChatGPT and legal expertise, some of these questions are coming to the fore again. And some of the assumptions about lawyers' expertise are starting through, it's very long processes. So it wasn't just kind of the introduction of the computer, but if we look at vast amount of time, we see that there are some areas in which lawyers' expertise get curtailed, and certain areas get carved out and kind of handled by other professionals. But nevertheless, the prestige and the traditional expertise of lawyers remained in part because it was enforced by a very strong professional tool. So for people to, I would say it in a different way. So lay people, or even secretaries or assistants or corporations or computers, are forbidden to practice law, including conducting legal research, because it is against the unauthorized practice prohibition. So that means that for years, lawyers guaranteed their position as these authorities on legal knowledge, even when alternatives began to emerge. And I think it's part of the story of why there wasn't a bigger damage to their reputation or to their authority.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Alex, for a wonderful lecture, and thanks everyone for attending. We have been thrilled to have Alex as our Tomash Fellow, and congratulate her again on the prestigious postdoc at Princeton University. So take care, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.